The date is July 10th, 2013. On a docked cargo ship at the Panama Canal, a biting, humid breeze cuts through the tropical heat, brushing against the legs of customs officials. The vessel's manifest officially reads 10,000 tons of raw brown sugar. It is the exact kind of high-volume, mundane cargo meant to put customs agents straight to sleep. But as the Panamanian authorities board the North Korean vessel, named the Chong Gang, the routine search completely unravels. Sensing an immediate threat, the ship's crew attempts to sabotage their own vessel, cutting the electrical lines and anchoring systems. The North Korean captain suffers a sudden heart attack mid-confrontation, and a young woman on board frantically tries to slit her own throat. They are desperately trying to protect a secret buried deep beneath the colossal mountains of sugar. As the authorities shovel away the heavy sacks, they expose a massive, highly illegal military shipment hidden in the hull. Weapons, operational missile systems, rocket launchers, components for Soviet-era MiG-21 fighter jets, and advanced air defense radar systems. All of it was bound for the isolated regime of North Korea in direct violation of United Nations sanctions. The president of Panama immediately takes to social media, tweeting live photos of the contraband. In an instant, the secretive regime in Pyongyang is thoroughly humiliated on the global stage. Thousands of miles away, inside the North Korean embassy in Havana, Cuba, a telephone rings off the hook. A brilliant mid-level diplomat named Ri Il-gyu is thrust into the center of this international scandal. His mission is seemingly impossible: manage the catastrophic diplomatic fallout, protect the regime's reputation, and secure the release of the detained crew. Against all statistical odds, Ri succeeds. Through masterful negotiation, he completely diffuses the crisis, earning the personal praise of Kim Jong-un himself. Ri is elevated into the elite echelon of the foreign ministry, eventually granted 7 private audiences with the most paranoid dictator on the planet. Yet, behind the polished veneer of his diplomatic status, the regime treats its best and brightest like absolute garbage. Ri is paid a miserable monthly salary of just $500. To feed his family and survive in Havana, he is forced to engage in illicit cigar smuggling, buying bribes from the very ministry he serves. Ultimately, the internal contradictions of the system crush his loyalty. 10 years after the Panama Canal crisis, Ri Il-gyu makes a terrifying calculation. He gathers classified cables, strips off his loyalty badges, bundles his family into the dark, and slips away into the night. But he doesn't just run and hide. He steps directly before the United Nations, addresses global assemblies, and publishes an explosive memoir titled The Kim Jong-un I Saw. The most heavily fortified dictatorship in human history wasn't dismantled by a foreign intelligence agency. Its internal mechanics were systematically exposed by the very man who spent decades maintaining them. Ri Il-gyu was not born a rebel. He was born in Pyongyang in 1972, right into the heart of the North Korean elite. In the country's rigid Songbun caste system, being born in the capital means your family possesses impeccable political loyalty. Your life trajectory is stamped by the state before you can even walk. Recognizing his sharp intellect, the state invested in Ri early, enrolling him in intensive French and Spanish language programs. He was funneled directly into the University of Foreign Studies in Pyongyang, a highly disciplined diplomatic factory that stamps out bureaucrats the exact same way a munitions plant stamps out bullet casings. The curriculum didn't teach the nuances of international relations or global cooperation. It taught ideological warfare. The students were trained to view the outside world as a hostile, predatory environment. They were taught how to look directly into the eyes of foreign dignitaries and deliver manufactured lies without flinching, protecting the regime's survival at all costs. In 1999, Ri officially entered the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But elite diplomacy in North Korea looks nothing like the lavish cocktail receptions enjoyed by Western diplomats. In Pyongyang, diplomacy is an exercise in resource extraction, state-sponsored deception, and sanctions evasion. Every North Korean diplomat posted abroad carries a triple burden. They must act as an official ambassador, an intelligence asset, and a financial fundraiser for the regime's cash-starved nuclear program. Ri quickly distinguished himself as an expert in Latin American affairs, focusing heavily on Spanish-speaking nations and Cuba. This was the Western Hemisphere, a territory located right in the backyard of the United States, crawling with foreign intelligence cameras and completely outside the geographic comfort zone of Pyongyang. Most North Korean diplomats preferred cozy postings in Beijing or Moscow, where the political gears were familiar and the host governments were highly protective. Latin America, however, demanded something entirely different. It required a flawless fluency in a language the regime barely understood, an intimate comfort with foreign cultures that shared zero values with the Kim dictatorship, and the raw nerve to operate thousands of miles away from home without a safety net. Crucially, it required the rare ability to appear completely normal. Ri had to navigate high society diplomatic receptions, engage in polite small talk with officials who viewed his country as a pariah state, and maintain his composure around the very people who would draft devastating sanctions against his homeland the next morning. Cuba wasn't just a friendly flag on the map for Pyongyang, it was a crown jewel of their foreign policy. It was a fellow socialist state floating just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. For decades, the close relationship with Havana allowed North Korea to loudly boast to its citizens that it was not isolated, that it possessed powerful anti-imperialist allies right in the shadow of the United States. So, when Ri Il-gyu was deployed to the North Korean embassy in Havana as a secretary in September of 2011, it was a massive, high-pressure assignment. He was the regime's point man in the Caribbean, tasked with keeping the strategic lifeline intact. And then, in July of 2013, the Chongchon gang crisis detonated in Panama, threatening to destroy everything. When the images of Soviet-era military radar systems and missile components buried under thousands of tons of Cuban sugar hit the global news networks, a collective panic swept through the North Korean Foreign Ministry. The regime's absolute secrecy had been thoroughly breached. Satellite imagery, international investigative reports, and UN condemnation rained down on Pyongyang. Ri Il-gyu found himself stranded in Havana, staring at a crisis that could easily result in his execution if mishandled. He knew exactly what happened to North Korean officials back home when Kim Jong-un was publicly humiliated. They simply disappeared into labor camps or faced a firing squad. Sleep became an impossible luxury. Ri went into survival mode, working around the clock to coordinate a desperate legal and diplomatic defense. Acting as the chief negotiator, Ri carefully worked the back channels between Havana, Panama, and international maritime bodies. He spun a highly controlled narrative, aggressively arguing that the weapons on board were merely obsolete defensive systems being sent to North Korea for routine repair under a legitimate contract, and that the ship should be released under maritime law. Ultimately, his meticulous maneuvering worked. Panama eventually released 32 of the 35 detained crew members and allowed the ship to return home after the payment of a massive fine. The captain and 2 senior officers took the formal legal blame, keeping the higher-ups in Pyongyang entirely insulated from direct legal consequences. Against all odds, Ri had successfully contained a catastrophic global scandal. In the inverted logic of Pyongyang, this defensive containment was hailed as a magnificent victory over Western imperialist aggression. Upon his return to North Korea, Ri was awarded a rare and highly dangerous prize, a personal commendation from Kim Jong-un himself. To understand the terrifying weight of that praise, one must understand who Kim Jong-un truly is. He is a ruler who has publicly executed his own generals for simply closing their eyes during a long military meeting. He is a dictator who operates on the fundamental assumption that anyone around him could be a traitor. To be personally noticed and commended by such a man means you are highly valuable, but it also means the spotlight is permanently fixed on you. In a dictatorship, a diplomat is valued for his ability to absorb the radiation of the regime's systemic failures and reshape them into a flawless narrative of victory. Ri had proven he could do exactly that, but that success meant the regime would demand him to perform the exact same miracles again and again with fewer resources and higher stakes, until he inevitably failed. And in Pyongyang, your very first failure is always your last. The turning point that shattered Ri Il-gyu's psychological ties to the regime arrived on a freezing morning on February 12, 2019. Deep inside the foreign ministry in Pyongyang, a mandatory order was issued to all senior staff. They were commanded to gather immediately at a military academy near Sunan International Airport. They weren't gathering for a policy briefing, they were forced to witness an execution. Ri managed to avoid attending the event because he was in the middle of being processed for his next diplomatic deployment back to Cuba. But in North Korea, a public execution is designed to echo far beyond the stadium walls. The details of what occurred that morning rippled through the ministry in terrified whispers, chilling Ri to the bone. The man placed before the anti-aircraft guns that morning was Han Song-ryol, the former vice foreign minister of North Korea and one of the country's most respected senior diplomats. Han had spent decades negotiating directly with the United States, managing the delicate framework of the nuclear talks. But following the catastrophic collapse of the 2019 Hanoi summit between Kim Jong-un and President Donald Trump, the dictator needed a scapegoat. The policy failure couldn't be blamed on the infallible leader, so it was blamed on the staff. Han was accused of being an American spy and systematically executed. Witnesses from the ministry, who were forced to watch Han's body get obliterated by heavy military fire, reported being unable to eat for weeks. The psychological message sent by Kim Jong-un was unmistakable. Your rank will not protect you. Your decades of loyal service mean absolutely nothing. Your proximity to the leader is not a shield. It is a lethal hazard. Ri Il-gyu looked at his own career and saw his future staring back at him. If a vice foreign minister could be executed over a failed summit, what hope did a mid-level counselor have? He realized that in the eyes of the state, he possessed zero human value. He was merely a tool with a built-in expiration date. This profound existential dread was exacerbated by the humiliating economic reality of his daily existence. Ri was an elite diplomat representing a nuclear-armed state on the global stage. Yet, the regime paid him a monthly salary of exactly $500. Think about the staggering absurdity of that number. He was tasked with running counterintelligence operations against South Korea, managing complex international trade agreements, and projecting an image of national strength, all while earning less than a fast food worker in the West. $500 a month was not even enough to cover basic groceries and rent for his family in Havana. To survive, the elite diplomat had to become a criminal, return to the lucrative Cuban black market, engaging in systematic cigar smuggling. He would use his diplomatic status to bypass customs, transport premium Cuban cigars across borders, and use the profits just to buy milk, meat, and basic medicines for his children. He was not alone in this desperate hustle. The entire North Korean diplomatic corps had transformed into a global, state-sponsored survival ring. Across multiple continents, cash-starved North Korean embassies were routinely caught smuggling gold, ivory, diamonds, and counterfeit currency just to keep their electricity turned on and fund their intelligence operations. The regime demanded absolute, unwavering loyalty, completely starved its employees of resources, and then looked the other way while they broke international laws just to keep the diplomatic mission afloat. The psychological weight of this double life began to erode Ri's sanity. In his later public statements, he described the deep humiliation of standing at international assemblies representing a socialist paradise, knowing that his shoes had holes in them and that his stomach was completely empty. He watched from across the fence as South Korea grew incredibly wealthy, culturally dominant and normal, while his own country sank deeper into isolation, paranoia, and medieval cruelty. He was a man stuck completely in the middle, wearing a cheap suit, pretending the nightmare made perfect sense. To prevent its diplomats from defecting while living abroad, the North Korean regime relies on a brutal, institutionalized hostage system. For decades, Pyongyang has enforced a strict policy regarding families posted overseas. Diplomats are generally forbidden from taking their entire family with them. They are forced to leave at least one child behind in Pyongyang as a biological insurance policy. If the diplomat runs, the child left behind is immediately sent to a political prison camp. But as the year 2023 approached, a rare alignment of variables occurred for Ri Il-gyu. Through a series of bureaucratic loopholes and sheer timing, his immediate family was with him in Havana. Furthermore, his parents and his parents-in-law back in North Korea had already passed away from natural causes. The regime's traditional leverage over him had unexpectedly evaporated. There was no one left in Pyongyang for the state to torture in his place. The invisible shackles around his ankles had suddenly snapped. The final catalyst for his escape arrived when Ri developed a severe, debilitating neck injury, a herniated disc that caused agonizing chronic pain radiating down into his hands and arms. The medical infrastructure in Cuba, broken by economic collapse, lacked the advanced diagnostic tools and medications required to treat his condition. Ri drafted a formal request to the Foreign Ministry, begging for permission to travel temporarily to neighboring Mexico at his own personal expense to receive urgent medical treatment. Pyongyang rejected the request in less than 24 hours. There was no debate, no medical review, and no compassion. It was a flat, bureaucratic no. That rejection hit Ri harder than any state propaganda he had ever heard. The system was telling him the absolute truth without saying a word. You are not a human being. You are state property. And state property is used until it breaks, and then it is discarded. By July of 2022, Ri's mind was made up. He began planning his escape in absolute, terrifying secrecy. The stress was monumental. He lost 7 kilograms in less than 3 months. He couldn't share the secret with a single living soul, not his colleagues, not his closest friends, and not even his own wife. In a North Korean embassy, there is no such thing as a colleague. Everyone is a potential informant tasked with spying on you. One loose word, one nervous glance, and his entire family would be locked inside a secure room and flown back to a Pyongyang execution dock. The mechanics of his actual escape remain highly classified, a tightly guarded secret designed to protect the specific escape hatches used by defectors. What we do know is that Ri selected a narrow, early morning window when the embassy's security rotation was at its weakest, ensuring his absence wouldn't be noticed for several hours. Just 6 hours before they were scheduled to walk out the door, Ri finally sat his wife and daughter down and revealed the terrifying truth. He showed them the airplane tickets he had secretly purchased. For a long moment, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. It was a silence packed with 2 decades of intense state indoctrination, the sudden realization that their entire life was about to be eliminated, and the understanding that if they failed, they would die. Ri looked at his daughter and delivered a single, devastating sentence. There is no future or hope for you in North Korea. They had just 6 hours to pack their entire existence into a few small bags, small enough to avoid drawing any suspicion from onlookers. They had to act completely normal while pure adrenaline flooded their veins. They walked out of the apartment, bypassed the embassy minders, and made a mad dash for the Havana International Airport. For ordinary travelers, an airport terminal is a place of vacation and homecomings. For Ri Il-gyu, that terminal was a narrow, terrifying corridor suspended between life and death. As they checked in and waited for their boarding call, the minutes stretched out like geological eras. Every footstep behind him felt like a state assassin coming to arrest him. Every glance from an airport official felt like the trap closing. The boarding call finally came. They walked down the jet bridge, stepped onto the plane, and buckled their seatbelts. The aircraft pushed back from the gate, accelerated down the Havana runway, and lifted off into the Caribbean sky. Below them, Cuba faded into the clouds. The embassy would take hours to realize they were gone, and years to explain how it happened. But their ordeal was far from over. When their flight landed in a third transit country, the next bureaucratic nightmare detonated. Local immigration authorities, confused by their unique diplomatic passports and lacking clear instructions, initially refused to let the family board their connecting flight to South Korea. Ri found himself trapped in a sterile airport transit zone, having successfully escaped a totalitarian dictatorship only to be blocked by an administrative rubber stamp. He knew that if they were forced to follow their original travel itinerary, they would be routed through a country that would immediately deport them straight back to North Korea. It was a terrifying limbo. Desperate negotiations began behind closed doors. South Korean diplomats, alerted to the crisis, rushed to the airport, engaging in a fierce diplomatic tug-of-war with local immigration officials. After hours of agonizing uncertainty, the legal gears shifted. The family was cleared for safe passage, boarding a secure flight to Seoul. They landed on South Korean soil with no fanfare, no medals, and no anthems. Just the quiet, overwhelming realization that they were finally safe. For the first 9 months of his new life, Ri Il-gyu lived deeply within a highly classified government protection program in South Korea. His physical location was kept a strict state secret, his movements heavily monitored by security details, not to keep him captive, but to protect him from the long, lethal arm of Pyongyang's intelligence services, which have a documented history of targeting high-level defectors abroad. But Ri refused to remain a silent, hidden refugee. On February 14, 2024, a major geopolitical event shook East Asia. Cuba and South Korea officially established formal diplomatic and consular relations through a quiet exchange of notes at the United Nations in New York. For North Korea, this was a massive, devastating psychological grenade. Their oldest, most symbolic ally in the Western Hemisphere had officially recognized their democratic rival. The strategic shield that Ri Il-gyu had spent years defending had completely collapsed. And the ultimate irony was that the system had collapsed because the regime had driven its best defender away through its own corruption and cruelty. Ri chose to use his freedom as a weapon. He stepped directly out of the shadows and went on a massive public offensive. He began granting high-profile interviews to global news networks, systematically dismantling the myth of Kim Jong-un's infallible state. He exposed the profound structural corruption eating away at the foreign ministry, detailing how senior bureaucrats demanded massive bribes from underpaid diplomats just to secure basic medical care. Then he did something far more dangerous. He demystified the dictator himself. In his interviews and his published memoir, The Kim Jong-un I Saw, Ri described Kim not as a terrifying godlike figure, but as an ordinary, deeply flawed human being. He recounted their 7 private meetings, describing how Kim appeared jovial and relaxed in private, laughing with his staff while running a state apparatus of unyielding terror beneath the theater. In August of 2024, Ri appeared before global assemblies. He recalled the agonizing moment of removing the mandatory Kim family badges from his lapel before stepping onto the plane, scraping 2 decades of state-enforced humiliation off his own skin. In October of 2024, he surfaced at a major human rights forum in Geneva, providing expert testimony directly ahead of the United Nations Periodic Review of North Korea. Then, in November of 2024, the South Korean Unification Ministry released an extraordinary trove of leaked diplomatic cables provided directly by Ri. These documents contained internal, top-secret instructions from Pyongyang detailing exactly how North Korean diplomats were ordered to manipulate, lie, and pressure foreign governments to deflect human rights scrutiny at the UN. The international press dubbed the leak the North Korean WikiLeaks. This was no longer a defector hiding in fear. This was a defector executing a systematic, high-intensity counterattack against the regime. On October 9, 2025, Ri Il-gyu walked into a room full of people at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan in Tokyo. Ahead of the flashes of dozens of global cameras, the former counselor spoke with absolute clarity. He told the international press that even the absolute elite within the North Korean system has no guarantee of a free life, a stable career, or a secure future. When Ri Il-gyu famously stated that North Korean diplomats are ultimately nothing more than street urchins wearing luxury ties, the words carried a devastating truth. It means the regime doesn't just exploit its impoverished population, it actively degrades, starves, and breaks the very intellectuals it depends on for its global survival. It bleeds its best people dry, and then acts with total bewilderment when they desperately gasp for oxygen and run toward the light. Ri Il-gyu did not betray his country. The broken and paranoid system of Kim Jong-un betrayed Ri. And in its cruelty, the machine inadvertently manufactured what it fears most, an impeccable and highly credible witness who can translate the secrets of the regime into plain language and transmit them to the entire planet. The system is now exposed before the eyes of the world, and the testimony of its own operator has become the irreversible crack in the walls of Pyongyang's absolute secrecy.